Interview for the Oral History Program at the Institute for Latino Studies at the University of Notre Dame. The date is November 14th, 2006. We are in room 208 of McKenna Hall, the University of Notre Dame campus. The interviewer will be Tracy Grimm, archivist for the Institute for Latino Studies, and I will be interviewing Yasmin Ramirez, an independent curator and currently visual arts researcher at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, Hunter College in New York City. Thank you, Yasmin, so much for participating in our oral history program. And can I ask you now for our cataloging record to state your full name, your date, and place of birth.
Yasmin Ramirez, Y-A-S-M-I-N, Ramirez, R-A-M-I-R-E-Z. I generally don't use an accent. Date of birth is 4/22/1960, April 22nd, 1960. Place of birth is Brooklyn, New York.
Thank you. And when we start the interviews, we generally ask if the interviewee would talk just a little bit about your background and where you grew up.
Okay. I am, you might call a native New Yorican. I'm born of Puerto Rican parents in New York. I grew up for the first 13 years of my life in Bed-Stuy, which was at that time pretty exciting place in the 1960s. Lots of riots, race consciousness. I think around 1974-75, we moved to Park Slope, Brooklyn, which was then a very emerging neighborhood in Brooklyn. Now it's pretty astronomically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Were your parents involved in sort of civil rights, or?
Well, my mother had me when she was very young, and my mother was initially quite involved in more of the idea of Black power. She always taught me that I was Afro-Boricua, Afro-Puerto Rican. My mother was very much a believer in Puerto Rican independence, and as a result, I grew up in a pretty politicized atmosphere. At home, we had posters of Pedro Albizu Campos. My mother would often play traditional music so that I would understand my roots, from salsa to boleros to danza to bomba plena. She also taught a bomba plena class in the local neighborhood. She worked at the church, St. Benedict's, and taught dance class. My mother was also tried to be a painter, and she would have a lot of arts materials around. Took me a lot to museums. So in that sense, I had a pretty rich kind of background, that together, of course, with a lot of interaction with African-American neighbors. I think my mother was very different insofar as she did strongly identify with the Black liberation movement, and unlike many Puerto Ricans who grow up believing that they should be apart from African Americans, my mother very much wanted us to be proud of our African roots. And she dated a lot of Black guys and stuff.
And how did you find yourself studying art history as an undergraduate? Was it related to that early?
I would say that my mom had bought me a set of encyclopedias when I was young. I was probably 3 or 4, and I was fascinated by the pictures and by art, by surrealism. By the time I'm sure by the time I was like 6, my favorite artist was East Tanguy. And I said to myself, I want to be the person who chooses the pictures in the book. I didn't want to be an artist. I wanted to be the person who chose what was remembered. So from a very early age, I pretty much had this idea that I wanted to be an art historian. And my mother also worked for a time at Local 1199, and 1199 had, at that time in the 1960s, a very active cultural enrichment program for workers.
And what is Local?
Local 1199, which is the health and hospitals workers.
Okay.
It's one of the most important unions in New York. It's quite powerful, and has always been, I think. And so I would go on marches with my mom. Like, I remember going to Washington, D.C. to attend a march because 1199 was very involved in the civil rights movement and workers' movement in the 60s, early 70s. And they also had a lot of programs for workers. They have a union, like gallery. And so I would go there for openings when I was younger. And I think that made a big difference in understanding that a person like myself, who comes from a working class background, could also be involved in the arts really through the union.
Mm-hmm.
I remember going to my first plays with the union, first restaurants. The union sent us to camp. So,
wow.
Yeah.
That's interesting. During your undergraduate and graduate work,
Mm-hmm.
were there any professors or scholars that influenced you or that inspired you?
Very much so. I would say, I mean, what you should know is that I didn't go to college right away. When I graduated from high school in 1977, New York was a very exciting place in terms of arts on the street, in terms of the graffiti movement and other kinds of street art movement, stenciling. You had the new wave, punk, as well as rap, all these different kinds of musicians pretty much coexisting at the same time and playing in the same venues. So I was what you might call a club kid. I really had my first experiences in the art world, aside pretty much like in clubs doing performance and just being part of the hip happening scene in New York. And so I didn't really think that college was as important for me to attend as hanging out with like artists that I thought were making history, like Jean-Michel Basquiat and Keith Haring and Kenny Scharf, all the graffiti artists like Lee Quinones, Zephyr, Futura, Lady Pink. So I was very much just involved in the East Village scene, and I became a writer for the East Village
I was
Eye.
going to say, how did
Fab
you?
Five Freddy. I wrote one of the first reviews of his work. My dear, dear friend Martin Wong, who died and did a lot of very important work on the Puerto Rican community. Even though he was Chinese, he kind of fell in love with Puerto Ricans and did some amazing, amazing work about the Loisaida community while he was alive.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that I really didn't need to go to school until 1984,
Mm-hmm.
when the postmodern movement, postmodernism started to really come to the foreground. And there was a lot of criticism about the kind of art, kind of street art that was emerging. Graffiti artists were called the minstrels of the art world because they weren't politically conscious of what they were doing. There was a backlash against figurative painting as only being about the market. There was a resumption of this notion of really of minimalism as the true avant-garde of the 1970s, rather than some of the more I would say outwardly political art that was going mm-hmm. on at the time, because we were taught that minimalist artists were that the form and the content joined right together, mm-hmm. whereas with figurative artists, maybe the message was avant-garde, but the way that they created the work was not, right? I mean, figurative painting was not as interactive, for example, as an installation by Richard Serra, in which you felt sort of like the way that walking through an installation, you felt this overwhelming pressure on you, right, with the big steel things that he would make, sculptures. That was seen as like really getting the viewer involved viscerally in this notion of oppression, or making them very conscious of their physical space. And so there was a lot of discussion, what is a true avant-garde? And the true avant-garde turned out to be minimalism. And even though I understand that, I decided to go to school to Columbia University, pretty much to do what I'm doing now, which is to revise our understanding of avant-gardism in the 1970s as being quite diverse, and really looking at what the Puerto Rican community did to create an avant-garde movement and appreciation for different forms of avant-gardism in New York.
Mm-hmm. And that's your dissertation?
My dissertation is called New Rican Vanguards, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Can you, and that leads to my next question that I had on my list, can you explain that term, New Rican Vanguard, and how you've researched it?
This goes back to the professors that really affected my life. I mean, I would say I studied with Molly Nesbitt at Columbia University, who was, one of the foremost theoreticians about vanguard movements in Europe. And so I took several classes with her on modernism and avant-garde thought. I would say also Professor Huizen. At that time, around 1990, I went to school between 86 and 91, and Columbia University was very much involved in defining what are different definitions of postmodernism. They were very exciting time intellectually to have attended that university. So Andreas Huizen, who I studied various European thought. I mean, Frankfurt School. I studied Marxism under him. I studied the Gramsci. I met my companion for life, Bill Lipton, really at one of the classes on postmodernism in Andreas Huizen's class.
I thought that connection would have been made through the labor union.
No.
No?
No.
That's interesting.
So there's Molly, there's Andreas Huizen, then there's George Udesi in my graduate career. George Udesi taught a class on Latin American vanguardisms, and that's where I got this idea that it's absolutely possible to claim that Latin American art and Latino art also has vanguardists. And we discussed, vanguardism in an international sense. At Columbia, unfortunately, you only got the sense that European artists were the true vanguardists, and artists around the world looked up to them and emulated them, but were not really in the vanguard because they were not the originators of this kind of thought or form. And in George Udesi's class, you got a sense of the simultaneity of thought and artistic creation across the Americas and even Africa. So that really opened my eyes to being able to claim that Latin American artists and Latino artists very much were part of the vanguard, the international vanguard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in that work that you did, the research for your dissertation, you had an opportunity to interact with a lot of really prominent artists. Can you talk a little bit about?
But I would say that during the time, I had always continued to be a curator and be involved in the art world.
Oh.
While I was studying. And that's why it took me like 11 years. So I was very lucky in that throughout my lifetime, I was never attracted to working in mainstream spaces. I never aspired to work at MoMA or the Whitney necessarily. I really wanted to work in the not-for-profit, ethnic-specific institutions. So when I was 17, I began working at the Alternative Museum with Gino Rodriguez, and he's one of the pioneers of really the Nuyorican movement, Nuyorican art movement in terms of photography. I worked at Studio Museum in Harlem, and I got to know a lot of artists and theoreticians in the African American movement of the 1960s as well. With, let's see. After that, I worked a little bit at Art in General. Taller Boricua, which is where I became curator of Taller Boricua, and that is where I really got my opportunity to interact on a day-to-day basis with people like Fernando Salicru, Nitza Tufino, and Marcos Dimas, who had a profound effect on my understanding of the movement, and who really took me in and mentored me and have been incredibly supportive.
Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I mean, when I went to graduate school, at CUNY Graduate School, I was very much like young people. I wanted to do what everyone else is doing, so my whole thing was the body, and I wanted to do my dissertation on classicism and the black body, and all, because at that time, women, feminist thought was very much interested in how the body is represented. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to, and Coco Fusco, I was very influenced by Coco Fusco and the native body and how that's represented in Western art history and all these other kinds of performances that artists of color were doing regarding the way that they're portrayed, their physicality is portrayed in art history, right? And when I became curator of Taller Boricua, I realized for the first time how, although I knew about these artists and all my life practically since I was a teenager, I realized that there was no scholarship, no substantive scholarship on the New Eureka movement. And so within a year, I had decided that I was really going to dedicate my dissertation to this project. And I think also working on Gil's collection, I was a curator, I became curator of El Museo del Barrio, and I worked on this exhibition called Pressing the Point, which was a comparison between the Chicano movement and the Puerto Rican movement in the 1970s, the poster movement. And it was really by doing that exhibition where I produced the first substantive scholarship, I think, on the Puerto Rican movement, and I felt like I could really do this. I was very intimidated, obviously, by the thought of doing this because I never, there's very famous scholars like Arlene Davila and Juan Flores, and how could I myself, you know, rise to the kind of level of scholarship that they've been producing. And I don't know if I've been able to do that, but I do feel confident that I can write a pretty good book on the Nuyorican art movement after doing something like Pressing the Point.
Yeah. And what year was that?
Pressing the Point, I think was 2000. Pretty sure it was like 2000.
And that was Gil Cardenas's?
It was a collaboration between the University, UT Austin, and El Museo del Barrio. El Museo del Barrio has one of the largest collections, as does the Centro, of Puerto Rican posters. And Gil has one of the largest collections of Chicano posters, and he had donated many of them to UT Austin. And so this was a way of really using putting two collections in the public eye and seeing what are the differences and what are the commonalities between these two of the oldest Latino groups in the United States. Yeah.
I want to go back to Taller Boricua, and I read about a statement about the social activism of Taller and the history of that. Can you speak a little bit to that and in relation to other kinds of arts organizations?
Well, other kinds of arts organizations in the Latino community or in? In
general, I guess. How do art historians across the world look at
I don't think art historians across the world are looking at necessarily know anything about Latino art.
And then my follow-up will be
art collaboratives at all.
How will they look in 50 or 100 years, do you think?
Well, I mean, the way that I'm positioning Taller Boricua is, and this whole book is to look at how the Puerto Rican community contributed and interacted with the larger avant-garde movement in New York. I think that in terms of Taller was founded in 1969, 70. The dates are often a little nebulous, as I'm sure you know, because when does a movement really begin? Is it when two artists meet up, or is it when they fill out the 501(c)(3) or begin to do activism as a group? We're talking about 1969, 1970, and it was begun by Marcos Dimas, Armando Soto, four other artists that I can't remember at the moment.
We'll add those in parentheses in the transcript.
And they wanted to begin an arts collaborative in El Barrio and begin doing work that related to the socio-political reality of what Puerto Ricans were experiencing at that time. This was the time of the Puerto Rican empowerment movement in New York. So you had groups like the Young Lords that were very active in El Barrio, and the Real Great Society, RGS, that was also active, and there was an urban planning studio in El Barrio that wanted to have local people kind of create their own vision of what they wanted the urban renewal plans to look like, and try and involve the barrio community instead of just taking whatever the urban planner said. It's create a kind of an intermediary and sort of populist architects to work and create a neighborhood that was very much reflected the vision of the people who lived there. So you had that going on. I mean, you had the Puerto Rican Student Union going on. You had the Puerto Rican Liberation Front going. So there was a lot of political activity in the late 60s, early 1970s throughout New York by the Puerto Rican community around issues of health, housing, education, particularly bilingual education, the institution of bilingual education. And Taller Boricua, the guys were in their 20s. Some of them were
and how did they interact? How did they interact
they
with
came together. Many of them had been attending school visual arts. They were getting their degrees. And they met there and began in the Puerto Rican Students Movement, also in the Art Workers Coalition, which was a movement of artists across the city to make reforms in how museums and galleries represented artists, and enable, to try and get some reforms so that artists had much more control over how they were treated. And they were also working a lot towards having museums recognize their limitations in terms of showing artists of color and women. That was a very powerful organization. It was also quite critical of the elitist composition of the art world. And they would use, for example, David Rockefeller was trustee of MoMA. So they would picket MoMA often in terms of making people realize that the same people who are controlling like vast amounts of wealth are also the people who are controlling, our access to culture, and bringing that to the foreground and saying, you've got to open the museum up to the working class and to minorities. So I think that they made a very important connection in the public consciousness between how elites control so many different aspects of what we can see and experience.
So in addition to being an alternative space, they were also working towards change.
Working towards change.
In the mainstream art world.
Yes. In the beginning, Taller squatted a building that was given to them by the Real Great Society, urban planning studio. And during that time, they created a lot of posters for political protest, in particular a big protest at the United Nations to free Puerto Rico from its colonial status, to liberate Puerto Rico. And then they moved into another building around 1971, a much larger lot space, which they rented. And at that time, the Taller grew quite a bit. And it was really the only space in New York it was a studio space / exhibition space, and Puerto Rican artists really had there were no galleries that were necessarily going to exhibit Puerto Rican artists, particularly Puerto Rican art that had some political content to it. Yeah. So they were very important as providing a space and a place for Puerto Ricans Puerto Rican artists who just wanted to interact and to find other people like themselves. So a lot of artists went through Taller and then found their own mode of working in the art world. But it was at least a space.
Sort of a nurturing.
Yeah. Taller Boricua and El Museo del Barrio sort of worked hand in hand up until the 1980s.
Yeah.
Many artists who were at Taller were also employed by El Museo del Barrio as educators. So from the very beginning, Taller Boricua and El Museo del Barrio were linked in terms of an ideology of being relevant to the Puerto Rican community and the artistic community at large, and of being artist-run. At least at that time, it was very much about an artist-run alternative space. And in that sense, Taller was very similar to many other artist-run alternative spaces that were happening all over the city.
I'm going to ask you later about that sort of division between El Museo and Taller, or how they've gone on different paths. But first I want to ask you today, Taller, when I visited New York and you showed us, we were there, and that the neighborhood, is Taller the same as it was in a sense? It's holding to its mission, and the neighborhood around seemed to be changing a little bit. How do you see Taller today?
I think that Taller Boricua, the issue that, one of the things that's happened with Taller is it's become a two-man operation, and people do criticize that about Taller. Marcos and Fernando have held very tightly to the organization and have not necessarily continued with we welcome all people to become part of the collaborative, I think they've done that in a sense because the mission of Taller now has been much more about saving space for cultural institutions in El Barrio. El Barrio is being heavily gentrified.
Yeah.
And since the 90s, since the late 80s, 90s, Taller Boricua and Fernando and Marcos have had like this plan of creating what's called the cultural corridor in El Barrio, which would be 106th Street, to have that really be safe space within the neighborhood for artist studios and not-for-profit organizations. And the building that they're in now, the Julia de Burgos, they really, which they renamed, was a public school that was going to be a men's shelter. And they got the city to revise that plan, and now there's a high school on the top, and then there's Los Planeros and Taller, and on the bottom there's the art gallery, and the other space is used as a community space, which many different kinds of activities have gone on during that time. Just recently, one of the directors of La Casa de la Gerencia, Puertorriqueña, died in his funeral. He was laid out at Taller Boricua, probably because the family really didn't have enough money to have a funeral parlor. There have been weddings there, there have been baptisms, as well as,
So it really is integral to the community.
It's integral to the community, and it's one of the affordable spaces that someone can rent there. And so Taller has been very instrumental in maintaining culture and cultural spaces in El Barrio, and making these kinds of claims for the community in city planning meetings and all of that. So Taller has really become very important in that respect.
And I'm going to ask you about El Museo del Barrio now and how it's evolved. And just to clarify, you did work there as a curator for a while, and could you talk about that a little bit?
Okay,
and then
let me explain. Let me just go back to Taller.
Okay.
It's 1969. What's going on? Marcos is attending SVA.
What is that?
With School of Visual Arts.
Okay.
He meets Armando Soto and Adrian Garcia, who's the other really important artist in this story, and Manuel Neco Otero. So really, Adrian Garcia, who was much more like the activist at that time. He was the person who was sort of linking different constituencies. And Adrian was also at SVA, and got Marcos involved in the first exhibition of Puerto Rican art, contemporary art, at the Brooklyn Museum. He helped curate that show. So many of these artists sort of met at the Brooklyn Museum at this show of contemporary Puerto Rican art. And that's when they decided that they really wanted to get involved in creating a permanent space where this kind of work can be exhibited and where there could be interaction among Puerto Rican artists. There was only one space prior to that, which was the Friends of Puerto Rico. That was located on 23rd Street, around 23rd Street and 3rd Avenue, I believe, in an old reconverted rectory or Catholic school. That was another space that was happening, that was patronized by Amelia Guerrera, who was a wealthy woman, and she got the funds together to create this multi-art space there. But she had a bit of an elitist attitude, and the artists were not that happy working in that space. As a result, they began looking for spaces in El Barrio. At that time, a very important artist, Rafael Montañez Ortiz, who was one of the celebrated avant-garde artists in the 1960s in the Destruction. He was one of the